Good to see everyone today. Let's start with a word of prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, we humbly come before you this morning, offering up thanksgiving for this day and all the blessings of our lives, for the health that we have. We're so thankful to see Tom here, even though he's suffering with his back. Good to see John Guerra here, and we know they struggle to get here, but we're so thankful for them and for all the others that are here. We ask you to be with our class this morning, be with our worship this morning as well. Pray that we do all things according to your will. Help us to worship you in spirit and in truth. Keep a good attitude. Keep the things of this world out of our mind. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, if you would turn to the book of Judges. Today is just kind of an overview. We're going to be talking about a little of everything. We just got done talking about the book of Joshua. And kind of how did the book of Joshua end? The death of who? Joshua. Good guess. Good guess. But then the book of Judges starts out, if you notice in verse 1, look here. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites? The Lord said, Judah. So here we get into a situation where Joshua dies, and then it says, now he's going to send Judah to take their land. Well, this is the same story you read about in Joshua chapter 15 and 17. So from what I'm gathering here, this idea that death of Joshua is a title to the book. Okay. Now he starts off with Joshua, kind of backtracking a little bit here. Now he goes back to kind of remind us of some things that happened back in Joshua chapter 15 and 17, and that's where Judah and Simeon take some land. And they were the first ones, because they said, once they conquered the south, they conquered the north, then it was up to the individual tribes to get their individual land. So then they said, well, who shall go first? Well, we know the tribe of Judah went first. They were the first ones to get their land. And where was Simeon? Do you remember? Yeah, Simeon was like in the middle of Judah, and they didn't get their own land per se. And why was that? Do you remember? We talked about two reasons why Simeon didn't get their land. Or one main reason for them is there was a curse placed upon them. Right. Yeah. Levi and Simeon killed all those men from the town, and so there was a curse placed upon them. They were not given as much land as the rest. So that's kind of how this chapter starts out. Then it talks about Adoni-Bezek. This is one of the kings of the Canaanites that they defeated. And what's interesting about him is they captured him, and they cut off his thumbs, and they cut off his big toes. And what was that king's response to that? It was a very interesting response. They cut off his big toes, they cut off his thumbs. Yeah, he goes, I deserved it. I've done that to 70 other kings. So he kind of like, well, I had it coming. But that's what they did to him. So it was really interesting there. But that's what this chapter talks about. Let me get back to our slides here. Let's start off with here. The book of Judges records military activities of 12 men. You think of a judge, you think of someone that sits on a bench and offers up judgment. In a sense, Deborah was kind of like that. But more or less, these are military men. These aren't judges sitting behind a bench. But we're going to talk about 12 men and one woman, designated as judges, whose God raised up to deliver the people from Israel from their sufferings caused by their sin. It can be summarized by this. The Israelites sin, and then they're put under occupation or slavery. Then they supplicate. In other words, they ask for deliverance. They regret what they've done. They ask God to forgive them. They ask God, and sometimes God maybe hesitates to do that. They have to ask him multiple times. But he always raises up a judge. He raises up a person to deliver them from their enemies. And then they have a period of peace. Sometimes it's shorter than others. Sometimes it's 40 years. But once that judge dies, what happens? Cycle starts back over, and they start into sin and slavery, supplication, and salvation. The 4 S's, might want to say. In reality, these judges were not legal experts, but military leaders. Its purpose is to teach Israel that God is faithful and certain to punish sin. Therefore, each person must remain loyal and devoted. This book shows the immediate generations after the conquest of the promised land, and unfortunately, the results of unfaithfulness are similar to what we have seen in their past. So, not good. Let's go to next slide here. It kind of breaks it up into 3 different sections. In chapters 1 through 3, we find that Israelites failed to keep. It mentions a lot of the particulars where they failed to keep their God's promise. They failed to take the land. You're going to see that in the end of chapter 1 into chapter 2. Chapter 3 through 7 actually talks more about the particular judges, where they sin and they repent, God rescues them, and then they have a period of peace. The last part, 17 through 21, kind of describes the horrid state of the moral decline of the Israelite nation. Specifically talking about a couple tribes like Dan and Benjamin. So we're going to kind of review a little bit of that. That's how Judges breaks up a little bit. We see where they didn't quite take all the land they were supposed to. They sin, God raises up judges. And then the last few chapters are very interesting, but it shows how Israelites have declined. So chapter 1, we've already talked about that a little bit. Begins with the tribe of Israel fighting to take possession of the land. The chapter talks about the victories of Judah and Simeon, but also mentions the failure of other tribes to drive out the Canaanites. They capture Adonai-Bezek, cut off his thumbs and his toes. They also capture Jerusalem. Also, Judah takes Hebron. Now, what's interesting, it says they capture Jerusalem, but we notice they don't fully capture Jerusalem until which king? David. And it's like a lot of the land here. They'll capture it, but they won't fully eliminate all the Canaanites from it. So the Canaanites will come back and they'll take over and they'll inhabit it again. And so that's kind of what's going on with Jerusalem. Jerusalem never becomes really an Israelite capital until David takes it over when he becomes king. But here we do say they initially captured Jerusalem, but the Jebusites will always live in Jerusalem and the area around it. And also it talks about Judah taking Hebron. And we know that Caleb took Hebron. That's one of Caleb's cities because it specifically mentions him conquering the Anak, the giants of the land. And Caleb was one that stood up and says, I want Hebron. I don't care if there are giants there. So that's chapter 1 is kind of review because we've talked about these things already. So that's why it was kind of interesting how it talks about Joshua, then it kind of reverts back to the book of Joshua and taking some of the land there. In chapter 2, let's go over to chapter 2. I think chapter 2 is really important because this kind of talks about the apostasy. Let's go to verse 1 in chapter 2 of Judges. Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers, and I have said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants. So he's reinforcing God's will, which is keep my covenant and I will keep my promises to you. And then he says, but you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you. Now this is where it gets kind of sad. Because they're sinning, because they're worshiping other gods and not driving out the inhabitants like he expects them to, now it kind of takes a turn. He says, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your sides. So now it's going to be more difficult for them. And we see that. We see that mentioned throughout Judges where Dan says they can't drive the people out, or Manasseh says, I can't drive those people out. They have chariots. So God is making it more difficult for them, but that's because of their sin. Before, remember what he said? I'm going to let you wipe out all your enemies. But we see the kind of a change here, where God is now going to make it more of a thorn in their side. They can still do it. It's just going to be harder.
In verse 2 of chapter 2, there's a question that God asked that we've heard him ask before. What is this you have done?
Yeah.
He asked Eve
that, yeah. Yeah. What is this you have
I
done?
see the very same question. You're messing me up here.
Yeah. Messing up my plans. And then notice in verse 6, when Joshua had dismissed the people, so see how now we're going back to Joshua? Remember, it's already said Joshua died. Well, no, it says that's the title of the chapter, and then it goes into where Joshua was still alive, and a couple of the people, or Judah and Simeon took their land. Well, now in verse 2, he is officially going to die. When Joshua dismissed the people, the sons of Israel, went each to his inheritance,
To possess the land. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the territory of the inheritance of Timnah, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. And that was one of the territories that Joshua requested, was Timnah. And we're going to see that story. We're going to see Timnah come along with the story of Samson. We're going to see Timnah mentioned a few times. All the generations also were gathered to the fathers, and there arose generations who knew not the Lord. Is that kind of a pattern in society? Young kids are just more rebellious and want to do their own thing. Remember the story of Jeroboam and Rehoboam? Yeah. Rehoboam went to the younger generation and asked them for the advice. And the older generation gave him advice, but he didn't take that. He took the advice of the younger generation. But we see that here, and it talks about the elders. When Joshua died, they still followed God as long as the elders were still alive. So there's something to be said about having older men around to teach the younger men and to guide them. If there's no older men around, things go awry. So it's real important in the church, and I think that's real important why God has elders and that they're not novices, right? A novice is a younger person. A novice is someone who isn't experienced. So we see here, as long as the elders were alive, they followed God. But arose a generation that knew not God. And that's the sad part here. So Israel turns in verse 11, then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, that they forsook the Lord. In verse 13, they forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. What's the difference between Baal and Ashtaroth? We're going to see that mentioned a lot in Judges.
Fertility.
Yeah.
It kind of went with the Baal, but they don't
Yeah.
use the name.
Yeah. Yeah, they're both fertility, but they kind of go hand in hand. And that was a common practice in the pagan worship is
There would be sex involved in the temples, and it would be because of the Baal and Ashtaroth. And if they had sex in the temple, then they would grant fertility, and it was just a whole pagan worship. But you usually had an altar to Baal, then you had a pole next to it. It was the Ashtaroth pole. And we're going to see that later in Judges also. But we see them both go hand in hand. Maybe the male-female version of each other. So they forsook the Lord. And then in verse 16, then the Lord raised up judges and delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. So that kind of just, chapter 2 kind of describes the book of Judges, really. Apostasy, and then the judges will be raised up. But it's kind of sad if you look at the end of that chapter, verse 19, but it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and more corruptly than their fathers. So each time they would get worse and worse and worse. Joel?
40 years ago, I heard an unofficial definition for judge, at least in my, and that is a fixer. And I think that's so appropriate for what we read here.
and the judges are all different. You know, a lot of them it just describes that they were a judge for a period of time, but we see differences between Samson and Deborah and Ehud, Othniel. We see differences between them. They're not all the same, but yeah, they're just to fix the situation. So the end of
Chapter 2, he says in verse 21, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel. So it is to test them, but can they still pass the test? If they wanted to, yes. I mean, he puts trials in front of us, doesn't he? But he gives us a way out. He says, I will always give you a way out. I don't think he's making it impossible for them to drive them out. He's just going to make it more difficult because one of the curses. You didn't obey me. This is going to be more difficult. Remember what happened with Adam and Eve after they sinned? Life got a little more difficult. Kicked them out of the garden. Adam had to work. She had pain in childbirth. That's what's going on here. So the Lord allowed those nations to remain, not driving them out so quickly. And we also know one of the reasons that he didn't drive them out so quickly, like initially he couldn't just go in and wipe them all out and have just an empty vessel there for the Israelites to move in. That would have been nice. In our think-sos, we think, well, that would have been great. God could have just snapped his fingers. Every one of them could have just died on the spot. And why wouldn't that work? Why couldn't they just go in with a clean slate? Hannah?
Wild, and the animals would grow.
Right. Right. That's exactly right. That's what God describes, because it would be uncontrollable. The animals would take over. And so that was wise of God. He knew that. So that was his plan, to initially go in, take some of the major cities, but then slowly drive out the rest of them. Chapter 3 introduces the first judges, Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar. Who is Othniel? He's the first one mentioned. He's actually mentioned earlier in the chapters here when Caleb goes to take a city. Karen? Yeah. So Caleb goes to take a city and he says, whoever can take this city, anybody, I will give you my daughter. So who stood forth? Othniel did. And Othniel is his nephew, his brother's son, his younger brother's son. So it's his nephew. So he comes forth and he takes the city. And so Caleb gives him his daughter. So he marries his daughter. So that's the first introduction to Othniel. So in chapter 3, it talks about him a little more. But it also mentions Ehud and Shamgar. So Caleb's younger brother delivers Israel from the king of Mesopotamia. So they sin. This king here of Mesopotamia conquers them for 8 years. And Caleb's Othniel rises up and conquers him. So they worship the Baal, they worship Asherah. And then Ehud, a left-handed man from Benjamin, delivers Israel from Eglon after 18 years of the Moabites. Now that's an interesting story too. Notice it says here that he's left-handed. And he's from the tribe of Benjamin. We're going to see that later when the Benjamites get pretty much destroyed. But it talks about they had 700 elite fighting men, all left-handed, all who can sling a rock. Remember David and Goliath? All who could sling a rock and not miss a target by a hair's breadth, it says. And that's an interesting story because even though it seemed like God was on the side of the Israelites, they attacked the Benjamites twice and lost because of those men. But eventually, the Israelites conquered them. But that's interesting because that's who Ehud is. He's a left-handed man from Benjamin. So you know he's probably wicked with the slingshot. Yeah. But how does he deliver them in this situation? So King Eglon has conquered them for 18 years of Moab. What does Ehud do? Remember this story?
Covers it with a cloak. And then he goes to pay tribute to this king. And he leaves, but then he comes back secretly. Mm-hmm. And when the king said, opens the door to him and he goes in, he tells them he's got something he needs to tell him, so the king sends out all his servants, and he ends up, killing the king with his sword. And I guess the king was really fat, because the sword went in, and the hilt got sucked in, and
Yep, that's
went
exactly
right
right.
to the bow and out the other end.
Exactly right. It says he made that sword. He made it a double-edged sword.
Right.
And he was left-handed, so he strapped it to his right thigh so he can just grab it really quick. But yeah, he went into the king, and when they left, they went to pay tribute. After they left, like you said, he
told his men, I got to go back real quick. So he went back and told the king, I've got a secret. So the king kicked everyone out of his chambers. And when the king stood up to hear the secret, he thrust that two-sided dagger into the king, and he was so fat, his fat came over the hilt, and he couldn't even pull it out. His bowels came out, and he locked the doors behind him, and his men they figured he was using the latrine. They left him in there for a while. Eventually, they knocked the door down and found that he was dead. That's how. But isn't that interesting story? He's considered one of the judges, a deliverer, but that's all he did. He just killed the king. Yeah, with a sword. So that's kind of an interesting story. And then the end of this chapter talks about Shamgar. What do we know about him? Shamgar. Not much, other than he killed 10,000 of the strongest warriors with it. Or Shamgar, the third judge, slaved 600 Philistines with an ox goad. That kind of reminds you of Samson killing the Philistines. But Shamgar was the first one to do this. It makes you think that maybe he's like a second Samson with super strength. Half of the judges, I believe 6 of the judges out of the 12, God says he gave them, rose up their spirit. In other words, he gave them superpowers. And Shamgar is one of them. Samson will be another one. But that's what happened here. Shamgar killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. All right, chapter 4 is Deborah and Barak. Deborah, a prophetess, a judge. Now, she literally was a judge. She would sit under a tree. It was called the palm tree of Deborah. She would literally sit under that. People would come to her, and she would solve their problem. So, in a sense, she really was a judge, but also a prophetess. She instructs Barak to fight against Jabin, the Canaanite king of Hazor, with 900 chariots. Remember, we've actually talked about this. And that's what's interesting about judges, I've noticed, is that it's not completely chronological. I think sometimes we're going back and forth between the period of the judges, maybe the period of Joshua. It's not for certain. But because we've already seen that Hazor was destroyed by Joshua and the Israelites, and they had chariots. But here we see another situation where we've got Jabin, the king of Hazor, and his chariots. Now, some things I've read is that Jabin could have been considered just a title of the king of that Hazor. This could have been another king. And they could have just rebuilt like a lot of the cities do, like Jerusalem does. They destroyed it, but then they rebuild, and the Jebusites take over again. That might be the same situation here. But the Canaanite king of Hazor, which is in the northern part of Jerusalem, or Israel nation, it was considered the biggest city in the Canaanites. But Sisera, so she instructs Barak to fight against Jabin, who's led by his commander, which is Sisera. They're pressed for 20 years. Barak says to Deborah, I'll go, but you need to accompany me in battle. So they take 10,000 men from Zebulun and Naphtali, which are up in the northern part. And with God's help, Barak and Deborah achieve victory. So Sisera flees after that victory, and she seeks refuge. So he takes off, and he comes to a little town. And this woman here, Jael, finds him and says, come into my tent. I will protect you. So she brings him in. She gives him milk and cookies and a blankie. She woos him. But she wants him to fall asleep, so she gives him milk. She gives him some food and a blanket. So he falls asleep, and what does she do? Someone raise their hand. Yeah. she just goes up with a tent peg. I mean, what a woman. She knows who this guy is. She knows that Deborah and Barak are chasing him somehow. She goes up to the tent peg while he's asleep and just basically drives it into the ground, goes straight through his head. And that was interesting too, because when Barak says, Deborah, I need you to come with me, but you will not get credit for this. He told her, you will not get credit for this victory. Someone else will get credit. Who is that? Jael. Well, Deborah was fine with that. So that's what happened, but that's Deborah and Barak in chapter 4. Chapter 5, the Song of Deborah. We don't need to go through that, but her and Barak make a song about their victories, like we see a lot of people do in the Bible. Chapter 6 is Gideon. Israel is being pressed by the Midianites for 7 years. And the Midianites, it says that there were so many soldiers and camels that they were like the number of the seashore, the sands on the seashore. And so they would come up and they would destroy the crops. They would take their sheep, their goats, their cattle, their donkeys, and they would starve the Israelites. And so Gideon is called by God to save Israel. An angel of the Lord appears to him and calls him a mighty warrior. Gideon, unsure, asks for a sign, which the Lord grants. So Gideon goes and gets some food. He gets some bread and some meat, and he puts it on the rock. And the angel of the Lord is there, and the fire consumes the meal. And so that's a sign to Gideon that God is with him. This is not the only time Gideon asks for a sign, though. He's a sign guy. He's got to see it. But that was the first sign that God is with him. So Gideon destroys the altar of Baal and builds an altar to the Lord. And then remember we talked about there would be an altar of Baal, but there would also be a pole next to it. So it says he gets a bull or an ox and he destroys the altar. He gets 10 men in the middle of the night because they don't want to be seen, because people would be mad at him for destroying their Baal altar. And they cut down the Asherah pole, which is usually made of wood. Then he tells them to build a new altar to God. So he takes 2 bulls, one to tear it down. The other bull he'll use as a sacrifice to God. And guess which wood he uses to burn it? Yeah, take that Asherah pole. I want you to use that wood. And so that's what he does. So an angel of the Lord appears to him. Gideon destroys the altar and builds an altar to the Lord, uses the wood from the Asherah to build and the bull to the Lord. Joash said to the men of the city, let Baal contend for himself. Who is Joash? His father. So the people go to Joash's house. We want to see your son. He tore down our Baal altar. Huh? Yeah, right. But what does Joash do? Joash stands up to him. He says, let Baal defend himself. If your God is so great, so powerful, let him take my son. So that's what he told them. Let Baal contend for himself. Verse 31, it says, he is pursued by the Midianites and the Amalekites. So now the Midianites and the Amalekites are pursuing Gideon. He then tests God by putting a fleece of wool on the floor. So this is the second time all the Midianites and the Amalekites are coming after Gideon. And he's still not happy, even after that first sign. So what's the second sign? Someone describe the second sign. Karen? Fleece wool.
Yeah.
The first time, if it was full of moisture where the rest of the ground was dry, and the second time, the reverse, the ground would be wet and the fleece would be dry.
Yeah. So he did it the first time, and then it wasn't good enough. Says, God, can you just next morning reverse it so that the ground is wet, the fleece is dry? So God did that to him for him. He got his sign, and he destroyed the Amalekites and the Midianites. Chapter 7.
Gideon, with God guidance, takes a small army of 300 men to fight against the Midianites. It didn't start off with 300 men. started off with 32,000. And then God said, this is too big. So he tells them, whoever's afraid, I want you to go home. How many went home? 22,000. So he's left with 10,000. And God says, that's still too big, because I'm afraid you guys are going to take too much pride in that. So what is his test? Someone tell me his test.
If they're sitting there cupping it by the hand, that's the one he chooses. But if they're down and they're lapping the water up like a dog, he says, get rid of that.
Yeah. And amazingly, only 300 use their hands. 9,009, whatever it is, used lapped it like a dog. And what's the significance of that as a warrior?
Being aware of it.
Right. Being aware of your surroundings.
So he says, those are the ones I want. The rest went home. So he's now stuck with 300, left with only 300 men against an army that looks like the sand of the seashore. Right? So, and he's got a buddy Pua, and they're still not, Gideon and Pua are still not satisfied. They're still not happy. I've never seen a guy that needs so many tests. So God says, well, I want you to go into the Canaanite camp. So him and Pua sneak into the Canaanite camp. And they overhear someone in a tent talking about a dream. And what's the dream? But do you remember? Just happened to overhear this dream, Karen.
A barley bread would roll down into the tent and collapse it.
Yeah, knock it down. So the idea is that something so small can knock down something so big and sturdy.
Which was to Gideon, 300 men could go ahead and take the Amalekites. So that was God's way of showing Gideon, see, I'm with you, and you're going to win. So again, this is the third sign for Gideon. So that's what they do, and they actually make a plan. They take the 300 men, they give them all pitchers, or empty pitcher. They give them a torch, and they give them a horn. So, and they surround the camp. This is what it looks like. They surround the camp. And when he tells them to, they all crash their pitchers on the ground, make this huge loud noise, and they all blow their horns and light their torches. You can imagine it's pitch dark at night, and all of a sudden you hear this loud noise and the horns and the crashing of the pitchers and these torches all around you. It makes it sound like there's an army around you. If they'd have known it was just 300 men, they would have been just like, it's just Gideon and his 300 men. That's nothing. But they didn't know that. So there's mass confusion is caused here, and they actually start fighting themselves.
Yeah. So that's the neat story about Gideon. He asks for multiple tests, and God gives it to him. And then they come up with this nice little plan to defeat their enemies. This nice little story, and then they have peace for a while.
Chapter 8, Gideon's later years and his death. In pursuing the kings, Succoth and Penuel, they refused to give Gideon's army any bread. So Gideon is pursuing two of the kings to these towns, Succoth and Penuel. And he goes to these towns and he says, can you guys, these are Israelites, can you give me some bread? And both the towns say no. And so Gideon remembers that. And after he destroys those two kings, he comes back, and what does he do? He punishes them for not helping them. So that's kind of what he does here in the end of his life. But Israel had peace for 40 years after this. And then Gideon Gideon had another son called Abimelech, and he also had 70 sons. But Abimelech kind of stands out, and we're going to see that in chapter 9. It says Abimelech was the daughter. He had a concubine. Abimelech was the son of the concubine, and he had 70 other sons. So Abimelech kind of stood out as the oddball. He was the black sheep of the family. Joel?
One of them in here says the meaning of his name is son of the king.
Yeah, I think that's what Abimelech. Go ahead.
One thing that's nice about Gideon, remember when he started out, he said he was the least in his family. So
Yeah,
you can accuse him of thinking highly of himself.
Yeah, he was scared, he was humble, yeah, you can say that.
They never accused him of thinking Howard.
And that could be why he asked for so many signs, because he was a little scared, yeah.
Well, or he
Who am I?
didn't
He
think,
said, who am I? I'm from
or he didn't think
a
much
small
of
family
himself.
and a small tribe.
Right, he didn't think much
Yeah.
of himself.
The reason I said that is, it confuses me. There were no kings. Is that just some kind of a...
Well, Abimelech wants to be king. I think that's the kind of the thing here. Abimelech wants to be king. So he goes and he kills the 70 sons, and he wants to be king of Shechem.
Right.
And he kills those 70 sons because Gideon's gone. So his idea is, I'm going to go kill all of his offspring, and then I will be the new king. I will be the new Gideon. So he does. He kills them all, and except for one. One of them escapes. So Abimelech, the son of Gideon, conspires to become
king. Shechem gives him 70 pieces of silver, and he hires worthless men, and he kills the 70 brothers, except for Jotham, who escapes. He is crowned king by the people of Shechem. Jotham rebukes the people of Shechem with a parable, and then flees. Conflict arises between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. So Abimelech's ruthlessness and cruelty are highlighted when he destroys the tower of Shechem and kills all the people in it. He attempts to burn the tower of Thebes when a woman drops a millstone on his head. So he's now the ruler, he's now their king, but God causes disruption between them and the people of Shechem. Well, he ends up going to fight them, and he goes to the tower of Shechem and burns it and kills everybody in it. And then he goes to the tower, there's another tower. He goes up to that tower of Thebes, and when he approaches that tower, a woman drops a millstone from on top before he can burn it down and crushes his skull. Now, it doesn't kill him. So kind of like Saul, what does he do? He asks his armor bearer to thrust him through with his sword. He says, "So it will not be said of me that a woman killed me." Now, this guy was a little different than Gideon. Gideon was more humble. Might have been scared, but Abimelech just wanted power. Abimelech wanted reputation, his son. So that's the difference between Abimelech and Gideon. Abimelech was not a good guy. Killed all of his brothers. So that's Gideon, that's Abimelech. Here we see two judges, Tola and Jair, briefly mentioned. After them, the Israelites once again turn to idol worship. God becomes angry and allows them to be oppressed by the Philistines and the Ammonites for 18 years. The land of Gilead and Judah and Benjamin and Ephraim. When the Israelites cry out for help, God initially refuses, but later relents when they put away their foreign gods and serve him. This is what I was talking about. Like, they asked God to help them, but he initially refuses. So they have to continually ask. Which, is that an example for us? Is it okay that we ask God multiple times for the same thing? Yeah, I think he kind of hints at that. If you want something and I don't give it to you right away, go ahead and keep asking. Right? We have that example. I think that's fine. He wants us to ask for it. The chapter ends with the Ammonites gathering for battle. The leaders of Gilead said to one another, "Who is the man who will begin to fight the sons of Ammon? He shall become the head over the inhabitants of Gilead." So, Gilead is the land on the other side of the Jordan, right? So they're being oppressed, and they're offering, whoever steps up, we'll make them our leader. And who steps up? Jephthah. Jephthah steps up. He's a mighty warrior. He's asked to fight against the Ammonites. He tries to reason with the king of Ammon, but is unsuccessful. Jephthah makes a vow to the Lord. And what was his vow? Yeah, the famous vow of Jephthah. He says, I'll sacrifice, if I win, I'll sacrifice whatever comes out of my house when I get home. The first thing that comes out of my house when I get home. I don't know what he thought. Was it going to be his dog? No, it was his daughter. So the two sides of that is, did he really sacrifice her, like kill her, or did he just dedicate her to God and she lose her virginity for the rest of her life? I kind of lean towards that side of it. But that's Jephthah. The tribe of Ephraim confronts Jephthah for not including them. They said, you didn't ask us to go to battle. And they got whined about it. And so he ends up going to battle with them because of that. So this is where Israel is right now. They're fighting each other now. You didn't ask us to go to battle, so he ends up fighting them. And here's interesting how he defeats a lot of the Ephraimites. That he takes the Jordan, but in order to kill the Ephraimites, he says, I want you to, if they tried to cross, I want you to say this word, Shibboleth, because they couldn't say it. The Ephraimites couldn't say it like they did. And so if they didn't say it right, he'd kill them. So that's how he got back at the Ephraimites. But again, they're killing each other. And then we see Isban judged for 7 years, Elon 10, Abdon for 8 years. And then we see Samson come up. He's born. Kind of like, same with Jesus and John the Baptist. A angel goes to Manoah, his dad, and says, you're going to have a son. And they give him instruction that you are not to cut his hair. You are not to give him grapes or raisins. He's not to drink of the vine because he's going to be a Nazarite, have the Nazarite vow. In other words, they're dedicating him to God from birth. So that was kind of good news for Manoah. But then Samson grows up, and he's a womanizer. He sees this Philistine woman, and he tells his dad, I want her. And so his dad tries to talk him out of it, but he doesn't. He's not successful. Samson kind of does what he wants. The Spirit of the God came upon Samson at a young age. So he's had power for a while. I think everybody knows that. Strongest man ever lived. I think Shamgar might get close second. But Samson, strongest man ever lived. You can see I have him here as my backdrop. But on his way, they're on their way to Timnah, and he is attacked by a lion. What does he do to that lion? Kills it with his hands, but how does he do it? Yeah. I don't know if you ever saw Godzilla. I know David and I went and saw the movie Godzilla versus King Kong. You know, King Kong attacked some of these large animals that were trying to kill him, but he grabs one of these large monsters and grabs its jaws and rips it completely apart. That's how Samson killed that lion. The strength that he had to have to do that is unnatural. Superman-like. Right. So, on his way back, he notices that he goes and looks at the carcass because he wants to admire his work. And he knows that there was bees in it and they created honey. So he takes the honey, starts eating it, gives it to his mom and dad. He goes to the wedding feast, and 30 groomsmen were there, and he gives them a riddle. He goes, out of something strong came something to eat. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of something strong came something sweet. He tells these 30 men, if you guys can solve this riddle, I'll give you all new clothes. That's expensive. He says, but if you can't get it, you give me clothes. 30 pieces. And so after 4 days, he says, you'll get a week. After 4 days, they can't solve it, so they go to his new wife, and they talk her into bugging him. And it says she nagged him so bad that he gave up the riddle. And so then he was mad at that because they solved his riddle. And so he owed them 30 outfits. So what did he do? He went to a Philistine city, and he killed 30 Philistines and took all their clothes. Now, when you read this story, it's kind of funny. And you see that Manoah is trying to talk Samson out of going to the Philistines and finding a wife there. But it also says that God is working through Samson to harm the Philistines. So this is all God's plan, that this were to happen, so Samson will be a thorn in their side. So he would go and kill the Philistines whenever he had the chance, because he had the ability, God-given strength, to do so. So, we only got to chapter 15, but we might finish this review next time. So thank you, everyone.